Hello, and welcome to the Irish Aesthete. Today, I'd like to talk to you about shells, and in particular, the mania for shell houses that swept across Ireland and indeed much of Europe during the 18th century. Shell houses have recently undergone something of a resurgence in popularity. Here, for example, is one that was created 25 years ago in the gardens at Kinoith, County Cork. From the exterior, it looks like quite a modest little octagonal pavilion. But when you step inside, you see that the walls have been covered with hundreds of thousands of shells, all of different sizes, shapes, and varieties, but all arranged according to a carefully conceived scheme. That's very much a characteristic of shell houses. The earliest use of shells for this kind of decorative purpose can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome, where it was particularly used for small grottos, intended to imitate those found in nature. The concept was revived in Renaissance Italy because both architects and their clients were keen to revive the spirit of the ancient classical world. Shell houses became a feature of Italian Mannerist gardens, one of the most famous being the Buontalenti grotto in Florence's Boboli Gardens, which was made between 1583 and 1593. Its walls are covered with stalactites and stalagmites, sponges, stones, and shells. But these aren't actually real. They were carved by the sculptor Pietro Matti. The fashion for such decorative follies soon spread to these islands, an early fan of them being King James I. In 1624, he commissioned a shell grotto in the undercroft of the recently completed banqueting house in London's Whitehall, designed by Inigo Jones. It's long since disappeared, and today the oldest extant shell grotto in Britain and Ireland is at Woburn Abbey, Bedfordshire, which dates from the late 1620s. By the start of the following century, the shell house obsession was widespread, and unlike the artifice of the Boboli Gardens, these used real shells. In 1725, the poet Alexander Pope built just such a grotto in the tunnel that linked his house to his garden at Twickenham, outside London. Decorated with shells, glass, and mirror shards, the grotto was so lovely that Pope sighed, were it to have nymphs as well, it would be complete in everything. It's no surprise, therefore, that around the same time, shell grottos began to be popular here in Ireland, brought to the country, we believe, by someone who in June 1734 declared, "I've got a new madness. I'm running wild after shells." This was the woman known to us today as Mrs. Delaney. Now, Mary Delaney is someone who deserves a whole film, if not several, to herself. Nowadays, she's best remembered for the botanical pictures created in her old age. She was 71 when she started and 88 when failing eyesight forced her to abandon the hobby. What's remarkable about these pictures, of which there are almost 1,000, is not just that they're botanically accurate, but that they're collages made from many tiny slips of coloured paper, one pasted on top of another. She called them paper mosaics. Now, I'd love to talk much more about Mary Delaney's paper mosaics, but that has to wait for another day. Right now, I want to discuss her interest in shells and how she engaged with these in Ireland. But first, a little bit of background. She was born Mary Granville in 1700, and when still aged only 17, was married off by her family to the rich and 60-year-old Alexander Pendarves, who hauled his child bride all away to a remote estate in Cornwall. Mr. Pendarves, who clearly was never going to score highly in any beauty pageant, had a bad temper and worse health, so his poor young wife must have been relieved when, after 6 long years of marriage, he finally died, and she was free to go wherever she wanted. Of course, the wretched Mr. Pendarves had never revised his will, so she was left without any money. But what she did have was an abundance of charm and a very good address book. So this particular merry widow then spent the next few years gallivanting around the place, travelling to visit lots of her friends. In June 1734, just as she was discovering her passion for shells, she set off on an expedition with a woman called Donlon, a noted early bluestocking, and together they journeyed all the way to the west of Ireland to County Mayo, there to stay with Miss Donlon's sister and brother-in-law, Catherine and Robert Clayton. A Church of Ireland clergyman, Dr. Clayton was then Bishop of Killala, one of the smallest dioceses in Ireland. Mrs. Pendarves found plenty to amuse herself while staying with the Claytons. Writing to her sister that summer, she informed her, "About half a mile from hence, there's a very pretty green hill, one side of it covered with nutwood. On the summit of the hill is a natural grotto with seats in it that will hold 4 people. We go every morning at 7 o'clock to that place to adorn it with shells. The bishop has a large collection of very fine ones." There on the hill, she and Anne Donlon acted as designers. While, she wrote, "the men fetch and carry for us what we want and think themselves highly honoured." One wonders if the workmen actually did think this the case. But anyway, today, sadly, nothing remains of this early instance of shell work in Ireland. And even the Bishop's Palace, where Mrs. Pendarves would have stayed with the Claytons, is no more. It was pulled down in the 1950s. Meanwhile, 11 years after that first visit to Ireland, Mrs. Pendarves returned to live here permanently because she married again. Her new husband, Patrick Delaney, was also a Church of Ireland clergyman, and soon after they got married, he became Dean of Down. Unlike Mr. Pendarves, Dr. Delaney was an extremely kind and intelligent man, and he was wealthy, his first wife having been an heiress. So the new Mrs. Delaney finally had some money to help with her interests. The Delaneys lived in a house on the outskirts of Dublin called Delville. Here, she started to make various items with shells, including urns and chandeliers, before turning her attention to the chapel in the grounds of Delville. In December 1750, she wrote to her sister that during the evenings, while another great friend, Letitia Bush, read aloud to her, "I go on making shell flowers for the ceiling of the chapel. I've made 86 large flowers and about 30 small ones." The following month, she wrote again, "I am going on making shell flowers. 6 of the festoons are finished and fastened on. I've 10 more to do, and then a wreath to go around the window over the communion table." We can only imagine how it must have looked because, alas, Delville is no more. Just like the Bishop's Palace in Killala, the house was demolished in the 1950s. However, Mrs. Delaney's work in both places deserves to be remembered because she helped to launch the fashion here for Shellhouses. And in the next episode, I'll tell you about 2 wonderful examples of this genre that still survive here in Ireland. Thank you so much for watching The Irish Aesthete. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.